Thank you for this opportunity to speak here today about the data quality considerations in EPA's Office of Pesticide Program's process for assessing ecological risk. In this presentation, I will be focusing on the assessment of conventional pesticides, but the process is similar for other science divisions within the Office of Pesticide Programs, where antimicrobial compounds and biopesticides, including microbial pesticides, are assessed. The Environmental Fate and Effects Division, in which I work, is where ecological risk is assessed for conventional pesticides. The division has three main functions: to conduct ecological risk assessments, to generate drinking water numbers in support of human health risk assessments, and to develop tools and methods for advancing the science of risk assessment. Within the division, there are roughly 89 staff members reflecting a broad range of disciplines within the sciences. Number of staff and their different roles in the ecological risk assessment process, there's a concerted effort to ensure that the process is relatively regimented and is consistent with EPA's statutory authority. To that end, the agency has developed guidance documents. For ecological risk assessment, three of the main guidance documents include the agency's 1986 Standard Evaluation Procedure on Ecological Risk Assessment, the 1998 Guidance on Ecological Risk Assessment, and the 2004 overview of the ecological risk assessment process. These are some of the major guidance documents. However, at last count, there are 711 guidance documents. The ecological risk assessment process, as defined by the agency guidance, is a multi-phase process which includes problem formulation, analysis, and risk characterization. Phase 1 is problem formulation, and it serves as the basis for the ecological risk assessment and describes the nature and potential risks under consideration. It articulates a risk hypothesis and it identifies the process that will be used to evaluate risk. In phase 2, that is the analysis phase, data on exposure and effects are evaluated to determine endpoints which will be used to estimate the magnitude and likelihood of an adverse effect or otherwise risk. Phase 3 is risk characterization, where risk estimates are generated and multiple lines of evidence are considered to determine if there are sufficient evidence to support the risk hypothesis. The risk assessment process relies on multiple lines of evidence, which include registrant-submitted studies, open literature studies that meet the agency's standards, monitoring data, and incident data. The incident data come to EPA through the general public, regulated industry, and state and tribal lead agency investigations of pesticide-related incidents. The analysis phase of the risk assessment process evaluates data submitted to support the registration or re-registration of the pesticide. These data consist of environmental fate data on product chemistry, its persistence and mobility, degradates that may represent residues of concern, and include data on not only laboratory-based studies of persistence and mobility, but also include data on the dissipation rates, which may include studies in the aquatic as well as terrestrial environments. Laboratory-based degradation and mobility data are used to estimate environmental concentrations, which are in turn used to estimate potential risk. When available, water monitoring data may be used as a line of evidence to evaluate the extent to which estimated environmental concentrations are reflective of what is being detected under actual use conditions. Also, as part of the analysis phase, ecological effects data are evaluated across multiple taxa and include acute and chronic toxicity data on aquatic and terrestrial organisms. Since not all organisms can be tested, EPA relies on surrogate species with well-established husbandry conditions such that the test species thrives under laboratory test conditions. In addition to laboratory-based studies, field-based studies may also be required. When available, incident data are also used to indicate effects reported under actual use conditions. The law requires the pesticide applicants and registrants to generate data to support product registrations. These data requirements are specified in the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, abbreviated the CFR. While the regulated community has the responsibility to generate data, the pesticide manufacturers generally no longer conduct these studies in-house. Rather, they rely on contract research organizations, abbreviated CROs, which have expertise in the studies and are familiar with the agency guidelines and good laboratory practice, or GLP standards. With respect to good laboratory practice standards, the studies conducted by the regulated community must be consistent with these standards, which are also specified in the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 160. These standards are intended to ensure the quality and integrity of data used to support pesticide registrations under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, or Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, and under the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA. EPA Office of Compliance conducts inspections as part of the GLP program. These inspections are used to monitor compliance with regulations and to ensure that studies are submitted to support registrations are done with integrity, are of good quality, and are scientifically sound. The GLP standards define processes used in assuring data quality, establishing and following standard operating procedures, and processes used for data retentions and storage. Each of the studies specified in the Code of Federal Regulations under FIFRA have internationally harmonized and/or peer-reviewed study protocols. For non-guideline studies that may be conducted to address specific uncertainties, the registrants will typically provide the study protocol in advance for EPA review prior to initiating the study. These test guidelines provide EPA recommended methods to generate data used to support pesticide registrations, tolerances, and regulatory decisions. EPA has published guidelines for environmental fate and ecological effects testing. They are referred to as the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention Series Test Guidelines. The guidelines are simply that is, they are guidelines, and therefore have no regulatory authority. However, they identify conditions and endpoints which the agency will be using to evaluate the acceptability of the study with respect to fulfilling testing requirements. This slide depicts the acute and chronic, as in case the early life stage test guidelines for freshwater and estuarine fish. These documents provide information on the test conditions and study design, for example, the number of treatments, the number of replicates, the species to be tested, and the data and measurement endpoints to be collected during each of these studies. Perhaps more relevant to the efforts underway by this group, the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention Test Guideline 850-2500 discusses study design elements for conducting field testing for terrestrial wildlife. This guideline is intended for studies with birds and mammals. However, some of the elements discussed in the guidance are common to a broad range of taxa. The guidance discusses the challenges with the variability associated with field studies and recognizes that the designs for such studies are dependent on whether they are intended as general surveys or screens, or to provide more definitive information on specific trends. In addition to registrant-submitted data, EPA also reviews studies reported in the open literature. To ensure consistency across reviews, EPA has developed guidance on the factors to consider with respect to the acceptability of open literature studies. The ecotoxicology, or ecotox knowledge base, employs multiple filters for sorting through open literature studies. For example, Ecotox omits review articles since they do not represent a primary source of data. Ecotox would also reject a study if actual exposure levels are not reported or if the duration of the exposure was not reported. In addition to the filters used by the Ecotox knowledge base, OPP has filters listed on this slide. For example, the study must include a suitable control, and control performance must be sufficient to provide a reasonable power to detect the treatment effect. The study must also serve as the primary source of the data and must be written in English. Monitoring data are an important element to the EPA ecological risk assessment process, as they serve as a means of ground truthing both environmental fate and ecological effect assessments, which are primarily based on laboratory studies conducted under relatively regimented conditions. Typically, these data are with respect to surface and groundwater monitoring studies. However, they can also include pesticide residue monitoring data in terrestrial compartments, such as residues in wax, pollen, and nectar. Such data may be in the form of targeted monitoring, that is collected to coincide with a pesticide application both in terms of time and space. The data, though, are typically in the form of non-targeted monitoring, so it's not possible to conclude whether the values are representative of peak concentrations. Although not typically thought of in terms of monitoring data per se, incident data, that is adverse effect reports, also serve as a means of ground truthing ecological risk assessments. These data are collected at the time of an adverse effect, which is suspected to have been associated with the use of a pesticide and therefore can represent a form of targeted monitoring. Even then, it can be challenging to document a cause-effect relationship. Interpreting monitoring data can be challenging, though, as it can be difficult to know what actually constitutes the background and/or baseline numbers and the factors influencing those numbers. While the data provided through the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service Honey Survey have frequently been cited as evidence in the declines in the number of managed honeybee colonies in the United States, even the 2007 National Research Council report on the status of pollinators in North America acknowledged that the challenges in determining trends when baseline numbers have not been consistently documented. With respect to the NASS data, the graph in the upper right is taken from the NRC report and shows a steady decline in the number of managed honeybee colonies since the 1940s. The graph also depicts from 1982 to 1986, there were relatively steep declines. These data are further broken out in the lower graph from 1970 to 2019. This graph notes, though, that from 1982 to 1986, NASS was not conducting the survey, hence the gap. When the survey was reinitiated, though, the methods were somewhat different. The graph also depicts, though, that since 1996, the number of managed colonies have been relatively steady and have actually started to increase. The point, though, is that standard methods are important to consistently collect and interpret monitoring data. Similar to the other components of the risk assessment process, such as the conduct of studies used to collect data for exposure and effect assessment, EPA has guidance for ensuring and maximizing the quality, objectivity, utility, and integrity of information released by EPA, as well as those data used to inform regulatory decisions. The reliance on a regimented process for collecting and analyzing data through the use of highly standardized methods is intended to ensure the objectivity, utility, and integrity of data collected through contracts with EPA, through EPA-funded grants and cooperative agreements, information submitted to EPA in response to regulatory requirements, as well as information voluntarily submitted to the EPA to inform its decisions. Data which do not meet the standards prescribed in the guidance documents cannot be used to inform regulatory decisions. The intent of this presentation has been to highlight EPA's relatively regimented process for collecting and analyzing data. The level of rigor that is applied to the review and analysis of studies used to support regulatory decisions is intended to ensure the quality, objectivity, integrity, and ultimate utility of those data. Through the use of highly standardized practices, there is uniformity and consistency across EPA reviewers that is readily transparent. This level of review goes well beyond what is typically done or expected for studies published through the journal peer review process. EPA recognizes, though, that such rigorous methods can significantly increase the costs of generating data. However, EPA reviews are subject to considerable scrutiny, and these data quality measures have been proven effective in ensuring that the risk assessments are transparent and reasonable. With that, I will conclude. Thank you for your attention.